Great. So, yes, you'll be hearing from both Stuart Murray and myself today. I've already, well, I suppose we've both introduced ourselves earlier, but as I mentioned, I'm a lecturer in the School of Mechanical Engineering. Stuart, do you want to say just a little bit about your background for those who are newly arrived?
Yes, sure. So I'm Professor of Contemporary Literatures and Film in the School of English at Leeds, and I'm Director of the university's Centre for Medical Humanities. I'm the Principal Investigator on the ITDF project, and we really want to talk you through some of the ways that the project works, some of the things we've been concentrating on, and particularly focusing on discussions of how we've tried to include disability experience and disabled voices in the work that we've done. Does that sound okay, Ray?
Yeah, great. So just to give you a little bit of information about imagining technologies, you can see that we've given a link to the project website here. I think that was also distributed in the minutes, so feel free to go there and have a look. It's funded through the Wellcome Trust here in the UK, and it involves four UK universities, the University of Leeds, where both Stuart and I are based, but also the University of Sheffield, the University of Exeter, and also the University of Dundee. And I think we have Finn Towns-Gray with us, who's one of the Dundee researchers. But tomorrow we'll also be hearing from Graham Pullen and Katie Brown. We'll be talking a little bit more about their approach to design. So actually we're going to hear about their element in depth. Today we're going to talk more about sort of bits that Stuart is focused on and the bits that I'm focused on. So let's hope that I can actually.
Oh yes, thanks. Right, I just thought we'd mention the image that we've got on our homepage,
yes,
because I think it's very striking. So our homepage image is of a man wearing what probably is kind of best described as a combination between a pair of cardboard glasses and a kind of mock-up of a VR set. So I think it's with the word Sanyo on it. And I think it's very striking because it's obviously an artistic representation. It's not about use in particular, but I think it reflects the way in the project we wanted to go against the idea that the discussions of disability futures and technologies is always about the end product of usage, that there are other ways to talk about design in particular. So it's this very striking image of a somewhat battered fabric/cardboard pair of eye coverings, really. And you can't immediately tell whether the man can see through them or not, which I think equally speaks to some of the things we're interested in. So a couple of things to add to what Ray has said, I think, very quickly. ITDF is funded by Wellcome through its medical humanities stream. Everybody on the project has extensive experience of working with disabled people, but coming out of a medical humanities funding stream in particular, I think it's worth saying that it has a slightly different angle maybe to certain modes of critical disability studies. I think especially social model of disability studies. Medical humanities tends to have a more cultural background, and it's been really lovely and interesting this morning to hear from Sophia, for example, about uses of art in the work that she's been doing, and more generally how MuseIT is engaging with music, I think, which makes MuseIT, I think, close to some of the work that we're doing. So yes, this is our basic structure to go, and I think we've now done the project overview pretty well. And we'll move through some of the work packages, I'll explain them, and then we'll get on to user engagement in our work and indeed what we've learned. So shall we go to the next slide now, Ray?
Yeah, certainly. Oops, hang on. Yeah, naturally, being an engineer, I'm having technology problems. Good. There we go.
It's worth saying this happens in all our meetings, by the way. Ray has technology problems, and he's one of our main technologists. So what we've got here is the three work packages that ITDF has. So on the left, imagining experience, disability care and embodiment. And this work package is split between the universities of Leeds and Exeter, and it involves people from English departments and philosophy, English at Leeds and philosophy at Exeter. The second work package is called Exploring Human Robot Futures Through Participatory Design, and it's probably this that is very relevant to what we're talking about today, and that is a combination of the robotics lab at the University of Sheffield and Ray working with us at Leeds. And I would say I think there's also been excellent collaboration across these two work packages. In particular, Ray and I have done some work in the seed funding, the smaller project that we did before we were successful in putting ITDF together. And we wrote an article together that may be of interest to anybody here. And I'm just popping the location where you can find that article in the chat. It is open access. And basically, it's a piece that explores the relationship between engineering design and cultural theory, if I can put it like that, around idea of prostheses. And then the third work package, Prototyping Ordinary Communication Futures, is the Dundee work package. And I think you're going to be hearing some more about that tomorrow, but it's explicitly around disability and design. So can you do the next slide, please?
Yeah.
So this first work package, Imagining Experience, Disability, Care and Embodiment, we wanted in ITDF overall to stress that all four of our words carry equal weight. So future, disability, technology, and imagining, working backwards across ITDF. And the imagining and experiencing, I think the other thing that for this presentation we would want to focus on is that question of experiencing, because that's where we've worked quite a lot with disabled colleagues. But in terms of imagining, one of the things I think that we wanted to stress, particularly coming out of a literary and cultural studies background, is the power of narrative, the power of stories, the power of cultural depictions. So in that strand, we have quite a lot of focus on, for example, fiction, film, media, because we feel very strongly that along with a lot of the social aspects of disability that are discussed, disabled people find themselves being represented through images and through narratives that surround them at all times. And we feel very strongly that that's a very powerful mode of representation, particularly around futures. There's an awful lot of cultural representations of the disabled body and ideas of future technology. So there's been quite a bit of work on that work package on those topics, some of which I think is on the next slide. Yes, so that is, thank you, Ray. So this is just an example of one of the kind of outcomes. I'll gloss it quite quickly because it's probably specifically an English studies kind of approach. So for example, I wrote an article which is about disability embodiment, speculative fiction and futurity that ranged across a whole series of novels. And that came out in the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. It includes, if you know it, Emily St. John's Mandel's novel Station 11, which was one of the most discussed novels at the start of lockdown because of its idea of a pandemic future, I think. Can we do the next slide, please, Ray? But equally, I think part of what Work Package 1 does, and this is particularly through with our colleagues at Exeter, is it talks about the ethics and the politics of disability future as they will become increasingly technologized. So, for example, there's been a couple of really interesting blog pieces that we've done about biobags and the idea of growing life through technological intervention. And this here, similarly, an image of what we've been describing as the whole idea of artificial wombs and the extent to which there is technological intervention in processes of gestation and the development through birth of animals and humans. And if you'd go to the next slide, this is a slide where the cover image of Larissa Lai's novel, The Tiger Flu, which actually puts these two things together. It is a novel which deals with ideas of regrowth and the way in which, as it says there, bodies may be formed in the imagined possibilities of the future. Often these bodies are presented as different, if I can gloss it in those terms. They're not all explicitly presented as disabled, although sometimes they are. But I think that idea of where does the different body, how does the different body rather connect to the idea of the disabled body is something we're interested in. And of course, the key question, how did disabled people read these stories? How did disabled people view the depictions of themselves in everything from Marvel films down to media representation in the news or the things they might find on Twitter or YouTube? Do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. The user engagement that we have on Work Package 1 comes through participatory workshops that we've been running now for nearly a year. They were very difficult to set up. ITDF started in January 2020, and as you know, basically COVID swamped the world from about March onwards. So we really kind of had to hit pause for the best part of 15 months or so in the work that we were doing. But the participatory workshops were always absolutely central to what we wanted to do. And what we have is a reading and watching group. So it might be, I think, slightly different from some of the other kinds of participatory workshops that projects might use. We work closely with a range of disabled people, particularly with the Greater Manchester Disabled People's Coalition, who we have good relationships with. And each week we read something or watch something, and that can be everything from, you know, a short YouTube video to a document to a blog piece. And we're working up towards watching documentaries together and reading some fiction. And that engagement helps guide us with the principles of design and practice that we do in the way in which we write about the ethics and imaginings of Work Package 1. So that's very much a central element of our engagement. And I'll talk a little bit about what we've learned a bit later. So do you want to do the next slide, Ray?
Great.
Which is over to you.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so I'm part of Work Package 3, which is exploring human-robot futures through participatory design. It should be said that this involves work from both the University of Sheffield, the University of Leeds, as Stuart has mentioned, and it's Tony Prescott down at Sheffield who's been looking after Work Package 3, and he focuses a lot on kind of human-robot interaction. On the other hand, what we've been focused on here at Leeds is the, excuse me, the process of trying to co-design technology. So we're not designing robots as such. I mean, I suppose technically you would argue that what we are developing is robots because they involve sensors, computation, and actuators, but they're not what most people would understand robots. So Tony deals very much with things like Miro, Pepper, which are very humanoid robots, and looks at how people respond to them. The idea with the work at Leeds was to have a sort of live development project that took what we had done in Suitcase that I presented earlier and carried on developing it and exploring it by using the prototypes that we developed in Suitcase as an early talking point. Now, as Stuart mentioned, COVID once again reared its ugly head. So this idea that we would straight after Suitcase, you know, we would be out and testing with people using the prototypes didn't really work out. But over the last year, we have now been able to actually go out and start testing with people, which has been great. So I've been inspired by Graham Pullen's mentor-led design, which he'll be talking about tomorrow. And I think while Graham's not here, I can say he's been a big hero of mine, and his book Design Meets Disability was a huge influence on me, 10, 12 years ago when it first came out. So we've tried to take this sort of approach of engaging with people like Femke, who was here earlier, or with Simon Dogger, who's a visually impaired designer in the Netherlands, who we met through Suitcase, and also with Russ Palmer, again, one of the advisors on Suitcase, to sort of have them mentoring us in terms of our design work and feedback. But again, it has to be understood that the aim is not to produce new technologies, it's not to produce new products, it's to explore people's imaginings for the future. And what that means is we have various haptic prototypes. beautifully modeled by my good self here. We've developed a more recent version of the hippie that was produced at the end of Suitcase. Like I say, nobody wants to wear a vest. The reason for using a vest is you've got lots of options about where you put sensors, about where you put different actuators. And that means we can actually explore and adjust them. And actually, one of the reasons for rebuilding the hippie was precisely to create the level of modularity that we needed for these kind of experiments, which wasn't feasible with the hippie made in Suitcase. And that was because in Suitcase, we were concerned about practical things like the reducibility, textilification, and that kind of thing. So there, the goal was to show that we could make a garment. Here, the goal is to have a prototype. But we've developed various interfaces. There's a little watch, so we can do a smartwatch type activity. We've created activities for walking around inside a room, being guided to a target. We've looked at things like doing haptograms on the back again. And also we've developed a sleeve that can be seen here, which will give more of a kind of a swiping effect using the vibration motors, and a simple reaching experiment. Now, the idea behind the reaching experiment isn't that we think that lots of people want to be guided to a particular target point on their desk. It was more a way of understanding people's ability to respond to haptic signals for directions and instructions without having to have them get up and walk around, which creates two problems. One of them is that you've got to set up a navigation network, and if we want to go into people's homes, that can be challenging. But also, of course, if you're walking around, you immediately get into all, you need a lot of space. You know, there are certain risks involved with kind of colliding with things. Having a more contained experiment gives people the sensation of the haptics and the feeling of responding to them in real time. But again, we're not proposing this as a product, we're proposing it as a prompt for discussion. And this is sort of the first set of things we took out to discuss. And part of the reason for this is that, I mentioned it before, people are terrible at imagining what haptics are going to be like. When you actually feel them, it's a very different experience. So yeah, we've done the first round of testing. We're now into the second round, where we're starting to look at how might we evolve these ideas based on suggestions that we've had from our mentors, and where we might take them forward. So that's exciting, all under development at the moment, and hopefully over the summer we'll get the chance to go out and try new prototypes with new ideas in them and find out whether they work as well as we thought they would. Not. So in some ways, this has a lot in common with the later stages of Suitcase, in the sense that we were doing testing and refining with people. But here the goal is to develop sort of insights and ideas for the future that we might use instead, and use Suitcase as a sort of jumping off point for future development. And another part of the idea is that this gives us a live development process where we can be reflecting on what happens in the other work packages as well. So looking at things like what's happening in work package 1, what can we learn from that? What do people in work package 1 think of the way we are developing things, and so forth. I've kind of covered the user engagement. So really the idea here is that rather than going out and testing with lots of different people, the idea is to try and engage in more detail with a small number of people. It does mean you can only do a small number of cycles of testing and discussion, but this is sort of the idea that people generate ideas and we can then go away, make some prototypes. They might be higher or lower fidelity, and actually reflect on them and say, well, actually, now that we've made this, does it work the way you thought it would? What are your ideas on this now? And I'll talk to a little bit more about that and how we've done that on previous projects tomorrow. But I guess a place to perhaps finish up, Stuart, is sort of what we've learned from doing project. Now, I guess there's two things to talk about, really. One of them is what we've learned from engaging with users. The other is what we've learned from engaging with each other, because a natural question is, why is a professor of English working with an engineer? And in what ways are our work packages actually crossing over? So maybe I'll ask you first of all, Stuart, what have you learned from the user engagement you've been doing on work package 1?
Thanks, Ray. An awful lot. I mean, I think I would just repeat your point about our decision to work with disabled colleagues as mentors. And I piggybacked basically on a visit that Ray made to the Netherlands. He's mentioned it, to work with Femke and to work with Simon Dogger. And I very much felt like a kind of somebody out of their comfort zone, in that we were mainly talking with and testing, as Ray has said, kind of the haptic navigation systems. But I found it incredibly productive for my own way of thinking to listen to the experiences. And I was very old school. I took notes because I think I would go back to that point that Ray has made about ITDF really focusing on process, maybe more than outcomes and outputs. So if you're, imagining is a process-driven activity in many ways, and at times, though not always, we're more interested in the experiencing moment than data, for example. And so to capture the conversations that we had with our mentors has been really valuable in a way of thinking about them as processes, thinking about the research as a research process. When I met Femke, for example, and realized that she has written a memoir of her experience with Usher syndrome, immediately talked to me as someone who studies disabled life writing. The learning experience then has been how to build the meaning of those experiences into what we do, and how to share with our disabled mentors the kind of key terms of what the project might be doing. So it's been a great space, for example, to introduce ideas of the post-human, I think, which have gone down in really interesting ways with our participatory workshop attendees. And also, I think when we talk to Simon and Femke, and what I take away from this, firstly, with regard to the users, your question, Ray, is how we can shape, especially ways of working. I think it's not just the actual experience that we're hearing from our mentors, but it's the ways in which they do it. It's how they want to shape a way of doing research through what they know. And I'm always trying to kind of tailor my thinking, as, for example, I might read novels or write on films, through the shape of ideas that come from those ways of working. And in truth, that's exactly what I've got from working with you as well, Ray. I was writing about prosthetics in fiction and film, and I thought, well, this would be done better if I went to somebody who designs them and knows about them and talks about them. And I think at that time that was new, very new and almost unique in the branch of disability studies in which I work, that you would leave, as it were, that realm of cultural theory to go talk to an engineer about the practicalities. And maybe I'll stop there by just saying, Ray, the amount I've learned from you is absolutely considerable. And I think we've got this really good working relationship going where we do learn from each other, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, I mean, it's, the feeling is reciprocated. I've learned a lot from working with you. And I think as an engineer, there is a danger of focusing very heavily on the technology and the science. And I thought one of the most interesting things going to the Netherlands with you was having you as a sort of an observer encourage more reflexivity than I think we would normally have, because all these assumptions, even when you're talking across disciplines, so when you're talking to people who do psychophysics, for example, they're the scientists, I'm the engineer, so it's different disciplines, but actually you share a lot of language and a lot of assumptions and a lot of ways of looking at the world. So actually having somebody coming out and going, why do you do that? You know, asking those kind of questions was a really interesting and really valuable experience. And I think actually one of the great things for me over the kind of the reading groups that we've done over the years has been learning about things like post-humanism, even, you know, reading things like Deleuze and Guattari, Merleau-Ponty. I mean, philosophers that, you know, for the phenomenologists, they all seem to know these people and their works. And I've never, well, I've heard of them because they're kind of vaguely famous philosophers. I know nothing about their work, but actually reading it and starting to look at ideas of what is design, you know, what is technology, what is the body, how does this fit in with it? It's been a really interesting experience. I think actually I've been fascinated by how much of it ties in with actual design thinking, and what is design for, and who should be involved in design and decision making. And yeah, I think engaging with users has been a really beneficial idea, because I'd like to think that over the years of working with people from, you know, sociologists and you know, people with a variety of impairments and people from the humanities, I would be, you know, internalizing all of this kind of philosophy, and it would make me an amazing engineer. But I still find that I fall back into my comfort zone, which is focusing on the technology, and then focusing on the technology that I know how to do. So the thing that I always find is every time I go out and speak to users of any form, they always, it's a bit, I used the term course correction earlier. For me, that's the kind of experience, is you spend ages thinking they're going to love this, we've really got to finesse this bit. And then when you try it out with people, they're not interested in that bit. There's this other bit that you've completely ignored, that you've missed out on. So for me, it's really valuable to be kind of challenged about these things. So, you know, by people in other disciplines, also by users. And I think I'll stop there, because that's yeah, that's what I've been learning, and hopefully I'm going to learn a lot more over the rest of the project. And we'll get to hear some of the work that Dundee has been doing tomorrow, and some of their philosophy around mentor-led design, which I think will actually be really helpful for MuseIT as well. So at this point, I think I'll move to the final slide and open the floor for any questions.
Thank you very much, both Ray and Stuart. Very interesting, and I have lots of questions, but let's see. Sophia, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart and Ray. It was really good, really interesting. I have two questions, which perhaps are going together. I was listening and I heard the word mentors, that you actually spoke about the relationship, and I was wondering how you did come into that kind of wording. And that leads me over to the second question, which is about explaining research, because it's something we have been thinking of from a kind of participatory research, participatory aspect. That how do you explain research? How do you get people research? Have you done any specific activities in order to engage people more, to prepare and to feel, you know, not just being an object, being, you know, coming to this object versus subject, as we all know? Thank you.
Ray, do you want to take the first one, the mentor, and I can maybe take the research process question? Yeah,
certainly. So I will say that the term mentor I drew directly from Graham, who will be hearing more. He'll be speaking on mentor-led design tomorrow. Now, I know that the term has positive and negative views attached to it. So I know some of the people I've spoken to, when I say, you know, is it okay if we put you down as a mentor on this project? They're like, that's amazing. Yeah, that's, you know, that's great. We love the term mentor. I do mentoring people. But also I know from Graham, at least some of the people he's working with hate the term and don't want to be referred to as mentors. And I think there is a danger in that it can obscure the power relationship. Is one of the dangers, because it maybe sounds like a mentor has more control than they normally have. I mean, also, I'm not sure if there's an element of getting into precise English definitions. So recently, I've been involved in a course on coaching. And so we look at the difference between mentoring someone and coaching someone. And of course, mentoring, the idea is you're using the benefit of your experience, whereas coaching is you're not bringing in your experience, you're trying to get the person to come to realization themselves. So in that sense, I can see two positives to the term. One of them is that it recognizes that the designers need guidance and can't just go off by themselves. The other is that recognizing that it's calling upon this sort of expertise, the experience that these people have, and that's where their expertise may lie. Now, of course, there are questions around, well, should we be, instead of calling them mentors, should we be terming them designers, and they should be part of the design team? Does mentor create a sort of, an arm's length removal? Now, in practice, that is what is happening with my work, certainly. So effectively, although we talk on a regular basis, the reality is that, you go away, you make prototypes, and then you come together and test. But I think it would be a very different experience if we were actually working together day by day on the same project. So no, I mean, I'd be very interested in your views on it as well, your thoughts. Yeah.
I really appreciate, Sophia, the question about research culture and research as process, because I think it's a huge issue. For me, it's both a critical theoretical question, but it's also a practical question that plays a lot out, I think, when you work, especially in a research institution, particularly in a university. Research projects are obviously subject to incredible time pressures. You have to write the application, you have to commit yourselves to certain activities. Depending on the funder, you really have to hold to the schedule you produce in the application, and you have to start from day one. It has to be an immediate start. Often there are specific outcomes in mind. And I think particularly working on disability topics, where, for example, the whole idea of time might be different. When you work with disabled participants, what constitutes research time is not the same as, I think, when you sometimes work on other kinds of projects. And so we've really kind of tried to focus on that idea of what is the very foundation of research time and research subjects and objects. I remember the first time trying out some of these ideas, going into a unit at a hospital in Leeds, which was a prosthetic and orthotics lab, and meeting people there and showing them a film and getting some really kind of almost puzzled responses from people who told me, academics always want to work with us. They always want to come and work with us because of prosthetics, but they don't ever ask us what we think, or they don't ever work at a time pace that works for us. And I said that was exactly what we wanted to do. So some of it in this question of research culture, and in fact, we have another Welcome project where this is the absolute focus. We're trying to say, what happens if you pause before you start? What happens if you examine the processes and structures of the research you're planning to do? What are the underlying principles? Does it have to be led by a PI, for example? Our other project is devolved leadership. So everybody from the project manager to the most experienced to the postdoc are shared leaders. So questions like that. And I think with ITDF, one of the things we're really looking to do is that our major output will be a large special issue of the British Medical Journal's journal Medical Humanities. And there we've worked hard with the editor to say this will not be a simple issue which has research outcomes. We will have podcasts, we will have blog posts, we will have interviews. We've pushed for the fact that our disabled mentors will write research articles that will not be standard research articles, but they need to be included as such. And so for that side of ITDF, I think we're really taking seriously the question of research as process. And we really want to present it as being, this is what happens if you're disability led. And I would just finally maybe stress Ray's point that being disability-led in a large research project is incredibly challenging. And more often than not, if you don't outright fail, you fall away from the outcomes you would like to have. But that itself is part of a kind of process of working and learning. And that's where we are at the moment. And I think it's a direction that a lot of university research projects will take, a better understanding of what you might call people and culture, as opposed to just a research way of working that leads to published outcomes. I think if you work with disability, that is not always where the research ends up.
Yes, thank you for very interesting responses and good question. Sophia, any other questions, comments?
Maybe I should just respond back to Ray. Well, thank you for the response to this. I know there is a different discussion in the UK regarding research and who can be a researcher, etc., which is very interesting in comparison to Sweden, for example. I just want to make a notion on that. I mean, co-creation is really a fundament of Show Music's work, and we are currently part of the research project, which is about exploring what is happening with hierarchy when you're doing a really co-creative process, artistic process. What happens to the traditional roles? And I suppose that is also part of what you explained, Stuart. I mean, when you have to sort of shift who can write an article, who should be part of, what kind of rules do we have? So I think that is a very, very important topic also to consider, who is doing what and how do we sort of pose these things. Yeah, thank you.
I'll put a link, Sophia, I'll put a link in the chat. A lot of people working this kind of area have drawn inspiration from a laboratory which works not as a disability project, but which works on Indigenous land rights and the environment in Canada. And it is very upfront about how you need to discuss your values, for example, before you start work, how you need to agree on the approach towards hierarchies and team membership and all of that. It's called the Clear Lab, and I'll just find the link in a second. But it is very inspiring in terms of how you might rethink that whole idea of what constitutes a team. And I do think, I suppose, apologies if this sounds too crude, but I do think it's a way in which humanities and cultural studies can hope to shine a bit of a light on science practice, and that humanities, particularly organizations like yourself, who are driven by creativity and maybe the more critical side of things, which will come out of a humanities tradition, I do think there's quite a lot that we can say about those processes of hierarchies, of leadership, of expectation, and how disability co-creation and co-design can offer alternatives. In effect, we're talking about power, aren't we? Can offer alternatives to power systems, because we know how power systems place disabled people nearly always at the bottom. And so in part, thinking of a research process that doesn't do that is really valuable. So I'll just find that site now and link it.
Great, thanks a lot.
Yes, I think we already are picking up a lot of topics that we can include in our discussions in October when we are meeting again, and lots of things like, for example, how to ensure that everyone's aware of the roles, and discussion of hierarchies, how we include people on equal basis, and the terminology as well makes quite a difference. I think, Ray, you had even some other terminology besides the mentor and coaching, or at the previous conversation, but would be good to have a selection and discuss what each one of them mean and how do we use those terms in our connections with our we call them our participants, but yes, I don't know what is the right term. But also, Stuart, you mentioned that you were more interested in experiencing moments rather than data. I wonder how that, and I also have noticed that we have had quite a lot of interactions with participants with disability, and every one of them has been an aha moment for me, and I have learned something that I have not been able to make good use of in our research. I wonder if you have some insight on how to bring these moments and experiences. How do you bring them to a research project?
I think that's a really good question, because I know exactly the kind of aha moments you mean. I had them, for example, when I was in the Netherlands with Ray, when we were talking with Femke. The sheer kind of revelatory moments of when she spoke, when she tried on the haptic navigation system, the same with Simon Dogger. They couldn't be captured as data, those moments, but for me, they were the most profound experience that I had on those trips. So I guess there are two things. I know everybody knows this, but obviously there needs to be an examination of what happens when you produce disability data, if I can put it like that. I'd never for a second suggest it shouldn't be done, but I wonder if it needs sometimes a bit of a better optic, a bit of a better sense of what disabled people themselves say when they are sometimes reduced to data. I'm not saying our methods are necessarily free from that, but the way I captured those moments was often through narrative. It was through taking detailed notes about what happened, about what was said. Another way to do it is through follow-up communication. So, for example, in writing back and forth to Femke about what our interaction and communication was like, you get, I mean, maybe it's too crude a word, but you get evidence of a certain kind, don't you, of how that moment was understood and was experienced. And here I think, you know, hosting material on websites is really, really useful, because a blog piece or a news piece like we did on ITDF for our trip to the Netherlands is a really good way of showcasing that in practice. So I wrote a news piece about our trip to the Netherlands, which talked about what we were doing, which talked about the interactions with Simon and Femke. And I get the point that may not be capable in any way of being turned into a research article. But to go back to my answer to Sophia's question, if you're thinking about the process of doing research, then the finished article isn't always the point, or the finished report. It's easier for me to say that because I know other people are doing that kind of research, yeah, and that's hugely important. And social policy work, for example, design work, your kind of work, Nazreen, you know, needs to address those questions. I guess precisely because that work goes on, I think sometimes a project like ITDF can take a different view, a complementary view, and look at the aha moments and what Ray called the prompts, and I've called the processes, and see them as equally as valuable as maybe the published outcomes. I think that's where we are, and I think maybe some ways of capturing them are old school, you know, so they'd be through interviews, transcriptions, note-taking. And again, I just say websites are so useful for the dissemination of the experience of those moments.